The iconic Negro Aroused, originally sculpted by Edna in 1935, is symbolic of her contribution to the arts in Jamaica. The work, intended to signify the struggle of the black man to break free from slavery into freedom, and metaphorically Jamaica's struggle for independence, also signifies the struggle and triumph of arts and culture in Jamaica. It is a representation of a vision of a people being awakened to a new consciousness. And in this new consciousness is where the artist can be, create, and inspire. The Honorable Edna Manley used Negro Aroused as a symbol of the Jamaica School of Art. Its inception in 1940, and remains a symbol of the School of Visual Arts here at the college, which bears her name. We're therefore quite honored here at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts to join with the Edna Manley Foundation to present the 2015 Edna Manley Memorial Lecture in order to preserve, document, and display the works of Edna Manley and to continue to perpetuate her memory. The late Professor Nettleford, in tribute to Edna Manley, writes, "She was a great and courageous artist who took risks, investing in the talents of the young from all walks of life. Edna Manley led the way in giving to our people an artistic voice, a mirror image of self." We welcome you and we celebrate this occasion. Thank you.
Dr. Brian Meeks is the director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies and professor of social and political change at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, Caveville, and St. Augustine campuses. He has also taught at Michigan State University, Florida International University, and Anton de Kom University of Suriname, and served as a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, Stanford University, and Brown University. His academic career has centered on questions of citizenship and governance, Caribbean sovereignty, and political ideologies. Professor Meeks is the author of many articles and over 10 books and edited collections, including the 1993 Caribbean Revolutions and Revolutionary Theory. A new edition was actually published in 2001. Other edited publications included the popular 2001 New Caribbean Thought, a Reader, and Envisioning Caribbean Futures of Jamaican Perspectives in 2007. A couple of his publications in the last few years have engaged the works of Caribbean intellectuals such as M.G. Smith and Gordon K. Lewis. Professor Meeks' most recent single-authored book, Critical Interventions in Caribbean Politics and Theory, was published last year in 2014. It's a series of essays reflecting on post-colonial Caribbean radical politics and ideologies. Meeks is also an artist himself of sort, a literary artist. His novel, Paint the Town Red, was published in 2003. On behalf of the Edna Manley Foundation and the Edna Manley College, we would warmly welcome Professor Meeks. His talk today is entitled The Politics of Edna Manley, a Preliminary Appraisal.
Dr. Nicolene DeGrasse Johnson, Sir Kenneth and Lady Hall, Most Honorable Mrs. Michael Manley, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Edna Manley Foundation, staff, faculty of the Edna Manley School. I'm going to do one thing before I start and make sure that my clicker is working. I think it is. When Joseph Manley, where is he, first asked me to give this lecture without further thought, but with great humility, I said yes. As for many reasons, none stated here, it would have been quite impossible for me to say otherwise. But then I immediately began to reflect on the mountain that I would have to climb, and the task became increasingly daunting, indeed frightening, because others have ascended this hill before and with extraordinary success. Thus, Wayne Brown's biographic reflections on Edna's private early years in England, mentioned earlier, and in Jamaica before the 1938 uprising, David Boxer's wonderfully produced Edna Manley, Sculptor, Rachel Manley's memoirs, Horses in Her Hair, and her carefully edited collection of Edna's diaries are all in their own way sensitive, thorough, and in many respects complete assessments of the life of this remarkable Jamaican woman. Yet, when I began rereading them all, as the inevitable prelude to my own reflections, it struck me that there was a clear and evident lacuna. Though it is impossible to consider Edna Manley without taking into account her evident role and insertion into the mainstream of modern Jamaican politics, and though politics runs through the interstices of all of these important assessments, there is to date no attempt to understand the politics of Edna Manley in its own right. This absence is particularly noteworthy if we recall that she was cousin and husband to one Jamaican national hero, often considered the father of the national movement, cousin to a second who actually led the country into independence, and mother to two sons, both of whom became members of parliament, and one, Michael, became the fourth and arguably most outstanding, if not always most lauded, Prime Minister of post-colonial Jamaica. And of course, by politics here, I'm not referring to her partisan inclinations, which remained, as far as I know, from the birth of the People's National Party in 1938 until her passing in February 1987, firmly supportive of that organization. Nor am I using it in the sense of the Greek etymology, concerned mainly with the business of the polis or the state. Rather, I'm using politics in two ways that carry us beyond this. The first is in the Aristotelian sense, which is concerned with a political community whose ultimate aims must be a conversation around how the good life is realized and how might it be possible and feasible to bring it into being, and how to bring into being a just society. The second approach, more Foucauldian in character, approaches politics as being at the heart of all collective social activity, including, therefore, that all social interaction, whether language, sexuality, culture, etc., is inevitably political, or a second wave feminists would argue with great effect, even the personal is political. From such a perspective, then, the questions to be asked would encompass a far more extensive spectrum and relate not only to Manley's overt political predilections, but to an appraisal of her times, her character, her social formation, the critical junctures and conjunctures that shifted her focus, and how all of these were reflected and refracted through her main media of artistic expression, sculpture and drawing, and in her less heralded but significantly important writing in her diary entries. To attempt to address these, I want to take us through three stages. First, I attempt to tease out the foundations of her intellectual formation. Then, I suggest two significant tensions in her life that followed her into adulthood and became a sort of muse and energy for her entire career. Then, I want to propose 5 main themes in her politics that derive from the earlier amalgam. And finally, viewing a selection of her most outstanding pieces, I want to think about how Edna Manley's politics was made manifest in her art. I begin with the foundations. And I hear this March 1st date, but that's not the date I know, so forgive me. Edna Swithenbank, born in Bournemouth, England on February 28, 1900, was the 5th child and 3rd daughter of Harvey Swithenbank, a Wesleyan minister, and his Jamaican wife, Ellie Shearer. Swithenbank had married Ellie during a period of residence in Jamaica and then returned to England, where, alongside peripatetic work for his church, he sought to raise a large family, eventually numbering 9 children. However, he suffered from repeated bouts of ill health and died tragically when Edna was only 9. Leaving Ellie the unenviable task of raising 9 children by herself. This brief and well-known summary of her origins reveals as much as it obscures. The turn of the century was a world very different from that which would emerge 2 decades later. It was the domain of European imperial powers that had conquered the globe, with few notable exceptions. Thus, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85 had divided Africa among the major European powers, ensuring that alongside the usual suspects, the newly emergent German nation, with its powerful economic and military bases, had its fair share of the continent's immeasurable wealth. The West Indies, of course, had, following emancipation in 1838, the Sugar Duties Act of 1846, and the institution of Crown Colony government in Jamaica after the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, slipped into the stasis and torpor of a colonial backwater. Loyalty to empire remained largely intact, certainly as an official transcript, and Britannia and her ideology ruled the waves. Central to that ideology was the question of race, and as Stuart Hall has suggested, racism in its sordid history has undergone many transformations. However, by the turn of the century, that is the 19th century, with the consolidation of European empire, a new virulent version based on scientific assertions of white superiority was consolidating. It would soon find a pseudo-scientific home in the eugenics movement, with its heinous notions of racial purification through breeding and separation of the races. But this is the point at which, yes, there we go. It is in this historical context that we need to read Harvey's marriage to Ellie, who is variously described by her great-granddaughter Rachel as mulatto, or by her nephew and later son-in-law Norman, reflecting on his mother Margaret, but equally on her sister and his aunt Ellie as an, quote, almost pure white woman, unquote. While it is difficult to discern in faded black and white prints what exactly Ellie looked like, my own conclusion is that in Jamaica she would have been a fair-skinned brown lady, not to be mistaken in polite company for white, but that in the less keen and discerning atmosphere of the Cornish coast, she would have passed quite easily if no mention were ever made of her colored ancestors. I raise the question of race, an often uncomfortable matter in polite Jamaican discourse, precisely because it is silenced and muffled today almost as much as it was more than a century ago. What were the hurdles, both psychological and social, that Harvey had to cross to marry Ellie? Or was her phenotype sufficiently white that the question was never raised? Certainly, one factor that has to be considered is that the young preacher was not just Methodist, but Wesleyan, among the more socially conscious of the mainstream churches then, as it remains today. Thus, in an online post, the Wesleyans argue that their church, quote, emphasizes applying the Christian experience to social issues. Discrimination and prejudice are key topics of concern, whether applied to race, gender, age, or other areas of life. The foundation is Galatians 3:28. And there's an internal quote. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus, unquote. Yet, whether or not Harvey was enlightened or alternatively ignorant of Ellie's background, she was fully aware. And since the question was unlikely to be asked in Cornwall, where they settled, then silence on this matter was for her the default condition. I harp on this because if Wayne Brown's assessment is to be given weight, then it is Edna's public acknowledgement of her colored ancestry which leads to seismic waves within her family and suggests the importance of those silences in her own formation as an English girl growing up in Cornwall, but with these anomalous, shady connections to the colony of Jamaica. But we are running ahead of our story. By the way, the one in the front of the picture, sitting in the middle, that is our subject. But we're running ahead of our story as we try to trace some of the critical elements in her formation. The silences and hidden tensions of her Jamaican background were accompanied by other critical features of her personality and education to help determine her peculiar formation. Edna was a middle child, and with the caveat of the dangers of my indulging in cheap psychology, she demanded attention. This impulse, assuaged somewhat whilst her father was alive by his indulgence of arguably his favorite, increased immeasurably following his untimely death. Described by Rachel as a, quote, defiant, willful teenager, unquote. She was a rebel at nearby Cornwall College, though she gained the respect of the headmistress, a Miss Hannah, who wrote her a remarkable character report, and I quote from it. She's original, and therefore she sometimes does the unexpected or unsuspected. Conventions are light and airy things to her, capable of destruction at a moment's notice. For anyone who desires not to be dull, to have many subjects on which to ponder, I recommend this youngster as a companion. I understand that she hankers after teaching. May the Lord have mercy on her and them. Unquote. It was this definitive feature of her character, a certain independent tomboyishness, an unwillingness to unthinkingly accept authority that guides her decisions and choices in these early phases, and indeed for the rest of her life. It was certainly recognized by her cousin Norman Manley, who, arriving from Jamaica and visiting Ellis' home shortly before taking up the roads at Oxford, is asked by his aunt, "Which one do you like the best?" and answers without hesitation, quote, "I think the plain one with the spirit," unquote. Another crucial element for which Hannah was responsible was introducing the impressionable young woman to the work of William Blake, 1757 to 1827. The English painter, poet, and printmaker, largely unheralded in his lifetime, had come by the end of the century to be a leading figure in the Romantic tradition. Blake, like Wordsworth, supported the French Revolution and adopted an attitude of ardent opposition to the abuses of class power in England. However, in his manifest spirituality, he was not by any stretch a typical Enlightenment thinker. While retaining an opposition to the established Church of England, still shocking in its day, he was never opposed to religion in itself. He advocated instead a more liberal interpretation of Christianity, which railed against the sexual conservatism of the Church, as he promoted a doctrine of free love far beyond the conventions of early 19th century Britain. William Blake, often seen as a progenitor of modern anarchism, would, I suggest, become the single most profound influence on young Swithenbank's intellectual and aesthetic growth. One need only look at the subject matter and form of some of Blake's work, such as The Body of Abel found by Adam and Eve, 1825, or the synthesis in his poetry of spiritual redemption with political radicalism, to see the patent connections and echoes in her emerging oeuvre. Two other influences appear to be significant to our purposes. Her eldest sister, Lena, was a first-wave feminist and campaigned with the suffragettes to give women the vote. While Edna would never herself focus on gender liberation and repeatedly in her diaries expresses reservations over aspects of the strategy and tactics of the second wave 1970s feminists, it is difficult to argue against the fact that in her unconventional, for Jamaica, resistance to female domesticity and her own artistic independence and leadership of the Jamaican arts movement, she was a gender revolutionary in praxis, if not in theory. The second is Fabian socialism. The Fabian Society, formed in London in 1884 and named after the Roman general Fabius Maximus, who famously adopted successful gradualist tactics to wear down the power of Hannibal's army, was highly influential in early 20th century England. Supported by influential people such as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, and with the competent leadership of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the Fabians were central in the formation of the Labour Party in the same year of Edna's birth and in forging its subsequent political form. While advocating for social justice beyond the typical liberal reforms and a social welfare system modeled along the German Bismarckian model, the Fabians stopped short of supporting radical revolution. Indeed, early Fabian positions considered the empire as the right and appropriate framework for development, and as such they could be considered staunch imperialists, though it should be recalled that the permanency of empire was very much a part of the zeitgeist of those times. One can, in scouring Edna's reflections, find cohabiting with each other the Fabian binary of both a deep concern for social justice and social reform, and a constant refrain of caution of the dangers present in precipitate radical approaches. What we can then summarize of Edna's early philosophical formation is that it was a heady brew of a rebellious and forthright personality with an unusual, unresolved connection to the colonies, which had been influenced by Blakean anarcho-spiritual sentiments, early feminism, and Fabian notions of gradually social change. This amalgam would come to a boil and take on new forms in the next phase when Edna met and fell in love with her cousin Norman Manley and decided after marriage to follow him to the land of his birth and the place of her imagination, Jamaica. I now want to look at the two tensions that I previously referred to, which I consider developed beyond her early formation. The cut and thrust of her unconventional love affair with her cousin is the stuff of Jamaican lore and shall not detain us except in its most important outlines. Edna, as mentioned earlier, met her cousin 6 years her senior when he was on his way to Oxford to take up the roads, and she was only 14. It would take 4 more years, the crucial intervention of the First World War, Norman's enrollment and fighting in France, the death of both Edna's brother Leslie and Norman's brother Roy in the war, and numerous letters exchanged for them to know that they were in love. My suggestion at this stage is that the critical hurdle that Edna had to face in entering this new phase was not so much the unconventional relationship between two cousins, but the color question. And caught up in this was the implications as to how she might define herself. Unlike Edna, whose phenotype was for all intents and purposes white, Norman's rich mahogany complexion clearly revealed his West African genes. In his sliver of a memoir, he makes the point that he was defined by his color in Britain. Quote, as far back as 1914, it was impossible to be in England and not be aware of the problem of color. You were immediately aware in 1,000 ways that you belonged elsewhere, but not there. You were different. Indeed, Vera Manley, Norman's sister, and with whom Edna was corresponding, and whose, of course, hall we're in, my apologies, and with whom Edna was corresponding as to how to approach and tell her mother, captured it appropriately in her response to Edna, and I quote from Vera, "You seem to expect a row. So did I at first. I have changed my opinion. I don't see how there can be a row very well. Auntie Ellie disapproves of cousins marrying, or says she does. Frankly, I think it is entirely because of the color question. And without offending all 3 of us forever, it's a thing she can't bring up. And the offense here is against Vera, Norman, and Muriel, which are her other sister, Norman's sister, who she's referring to." Unquote. Yet Ellie would try one last time on the eve of the wedding to dissuade them. That is, Ellie, Edna's mother, would try to dissuade them. Wayne Brown writes, and I quote, "With a fortnight to go, Ellie Swithenbank, who had vacillated between a reluctant acceptance and fits of anxiety, raised once more the question of the undesirability of children in a mixed marriage. Norman, in barely restrained anger, wrote to Edna asking her permission, and I quote in the quotes from Norman, to point out to Edna's family 1 or 2 moral trifles that they don't seem to grasp." That's Norman. To which Edna responded to Norman, and this is Edna, "Leave her alone and she'll get accustomed to anything. Argue against her and you'll drive her to the wildest extremes. You'll upset the wedding and I'll lose my little remnant of a home forever." From the obvious contradictions in Ellie's assertions, she herself was mixed, and so by implication were her children. Edna's retreat on frontal confrontation seemed to have been only tactical. More profoundly, she had evidently, in marrying Norman, taken the decision to cross the barrier of psychological denial and silence in her own family and accept wholeheartedly her colored, read black, heritage. In a memorable letter written to Norman in the heat of the tension with her mother, she declares, quote, "The colored, that is mixed race, can never die out. The colored race has to go on now. White people are going to be forced to accept them when they see them developing superior intellects with fine physiques. It is a race that is beginning. It has enormous possibilities and with a great tendency towards producing that indefinable person, the genius. I want to do my share towards improving and helping on a new race. We are both intelligent, and I have great hopes of what our children will be. I don't want him to be white. I want him to have your own beautiful brown skin, and I want him to grow up proud of his race," unquote. It is this quantum shift towards a new perception of how to define herself that would provide a central tension in the rest of Edna Manley's highly creative career. Phenotypically white, and with a mother who had hidden any connection to blackness, Edna had in her self-perception become black. In her wider family, this tension was never resolved, and when years later in a London interview, she let slip the fact of her colored heritage, it led to splits, some irrevocable, within her family. But for her, this moment had been a crossing of the Rubicon, which eventually led to the island of Jamaica, and a commitment to its people that permeates her work from Beat Seller through Eve to Dawn and beyond. Edna and Norman were married in June of 1921. Just short of a year later, their first son Douglas was born in London, and 11 weeks later, infant in tow, they were on the banana boat commuter headed for Jamaica. Confronting the question of race is something that Edna had done, as we have suggested, before leaving England. However, Jamaica, with its sharp class differences, persistent though somewhat differently constructed barriers of color and race, along with a stifling parochialism, presented new challenges. Her attempts to negotiate these new hurdles together constitute the second tension which determines her approach to her new home and comes for the remainder of her life to permeate her work. Jamaica in 1922, even with her sister-in-law Vera's assertion that it would be a better place for them to raise children, retained the unforgiving and unreconstructed color hierarchies of the plantation. Writing with reference to his mother's marriage to Thomas Manley, that's Margaret and Thomas, at a somewhat earlier period, Norman noted that when the very fair Margaret married, quote, a near black man, unquote, she was isolated, as nearly all of her friends deserted her. Edna, for her part, faced multiple hostilities. She was visibly white and married to a dark brown man, which put her in almost the space Margaret had occupied with Thomas. But more peculiarly, she was a young artist coming out of the school of up-and-coming young sculptors in the active and hectic London scene. In Jamaica, not only was there very little art, but that which existed was oriented more to the decorative than the critical, inquisitive, and avant-garde. And persons, particularly foreigners not engaged in the traditional professions or in business, much more in the full-time occupation of sculpting, were looked on with suspicion. The social scene too was barren, and Edna could not stomach the Jamaican habit of relegating the women to one room, while the men gathered to drink and smoke and discuss business and politics in another. Has it ended? Moreover, the couple was poor, and there was a child to raise and support without at first any domestic help. Arriving in the island with £50 sterling, it would be many years before Norman's success as a barrister would make them relatively comfortable. And then there was the oppressive heat of the Jamaican summer, which triggered her first exodus to Mandeville, where there was some relief from the humidity, but not from the constraints of the society, leading to her second exit, home with her son to England in October 1923, with no immediate indication of returning. Indeed, her return the following year, no doubt missing Norman, with whom she remained deeply in love, was only triggered after his purchase of a rundown house on extensive lands near Four Roads in St. Andrew, what would become the famous Drumblier residence. I mentioned the sequence to suggest that there was a restlessness surrounding Edna's engagement with Jamaica, in which she never quite came to terms with its social hierarchies. Norman provided her with a nest, Drumblier, and later Namdini in the Blue Mountains, in which she could raise a family and engage in her profession of drawing and sculpting. But her engagement with the society was always tentative, critical, and partial. She was in the society as Barrister Manley's and much later Premier Manley's wife and companion, but she was never of the society in the sense of fully imbibing and accepting its middle-class structures, norms, and aspirations. This 1985 remark, jumping forwards in time of course, in her diaries, made albeit at a different time of severe economic hardship, and following Michael's stinging defeat in 1980, is nonetheless typical of the distances she chose to take, as much as the empathies she sought to adopt. I quote, "We wail about the cost of living that goes up and up. The well-off people can still afford to live, so they grumble, but they buy. Most of the middle class still cling on to living beyond their means. They don't really give up any of their comforts, but they do more than wail. They protest loudly. But it is the children of the poor in rural areas who leave for school in the mornings with a cup of tea with no milk and a little sugar to make it palatable. There's a whole age group who are going to grow up second-class citizens because they are so underfed. They won't have the health and the stamina to be anything else," unquote. At the same time as the white wife of Barrister Manley, there were the inevitable barriers that existed between her and the majority of black Jamaican urban and rural people. As Wayne Brown describes an experience from the first brief sojourn in Mandeville, quote, "Leaving Douglas with the nurse in the shade, she wandered down to the marketplace to sit on a wall and sketch. She could hardly have escaped altogether, although she later asserted this. The resentment of the peasants against her, for as a contemporary English visitor bitterly put it, for the crime of being white," unquote. I suggest then that the two critical tensions which inhabited Edna's work, distinct though connected to each other, was first, the tension inherent in her decision to embrace her black heritage, and second, the tensions arising from the insider-outsider contradictions in which her growing love for her new country, indeed her mother's country, struggled with her sharp distaste for its sclerotic structures and normative social constructs and cultures. I want to move now to 5 central themes in her politics. If we start with these two underlying tensions related to her encounter with Norman and her subsequent marriage and emigration to Jamaica, and connect these to the formative features that we have previously sketched as critical in her philosophical formation, then we can suggest 5 distinct political themes deriving from them that are consistent throughout the rest of her life in Jamaica. First, there is a sympathetic and laudatory appraisal and validation of black people, of poor people, and of democratic majorities. I'll return to this in the final part of my talk as we look more carefully at some of her work. Second, there's a nationalism that runs through much of her work. In other words, a positive sense of the possibilities inherent in the ability of the majority of black people to achieve what they will. This heartfelt outburst 2 months after the 1983 Grenada invasion expresses that sentiment as much as it does her despair at that particular low point of Caribbean sovereign expression. I quote, "I am old and going out. If I can just make it quickly, as I can't call to the youth of Jamaica to give Jamaica a chance, to give it support, leadership, imagination. To hell with America and Russia too. Why can't we give our own leadership?" Unquote. Third, there is a certain spiritualism, though tinged with agnosticism, perhaps best understood from an appreciation of her Blakean influences, which pervades her diaries and indeed her drawings and sculpture. She retained a healthy respect for science, symbols, and the afterlife, and certainly for biblical scripture, while retaining a distinctly anti-establishmentarianism towards the formal church. Fourth, there is a strong social reformist current through much of her work. Edna Manley was undoubtedly socialist, but Fabian moderation was never far from the surface. Thus, she was instinctively hostile to Soviet communism, as she was to some of the more precipitate actions of the local left, whether within the PNP or outside of it. Fifth, closely linked to the fourth point is a spirit of compromise, perhaps the most important legacy of her politics, which pervades her entire life and which is captured most poignantly at the time of Bustamante's death in 1977. I want to spend a little time on this because it is difficult to capture it in her art, yet it is so important in understanding the nature of her persona and of her philosophy. Bustamante, of course, had been the bane of Norman's political life. A founding member of the People's National Party, He had left it to form his own Jamaica Labour Party when he realized that he no longer needed Manley and the PNP to win elections. A supporter if tepid of federation, he abandoned the idea when he realized that significant local support had shifted for various and differing reasons against the idea and advocated instead single island independence. The supreme irony is that Manley, who had undoubtedly led the movement against colonialism, was shunted aside by popular mandate, and Bustamante, who had initially been against the idea of independence, became the country's first prime minister. Norman and indeed Edna had every reason to disdain Bustamante. Yet, when Edna heard what she considered as the poor way in which the pro-government media, her son Michael was then in power, and I must admit that I was a member of that media. I didn't write the release song. Had heralded the news of his death, she was livid with anger, and in her diary gave Bustamante what she thought was his due. Quote, "He did Norman and Jamaica many things which I never forgave. He never saw a new image that was waiting to be born. One couldn't hold him responsible for that. He had never seen it in those terms. But all his life he did look out for the cause of the poor and needy, and in his own vain, arrogant way, he was kind." Unquote. Well, that's backhanded, but we can talk about it. Exploring Edna's work. In the final part of my talk, I want to undertake with some trepidation, particularly as a social and political theorist, treading in the den, as it were, of the guardians of aesthetic representation here at the Edna Manley School. A brief reading of some of her work through the lens of our prior three-part discussion of her formation, the two critical and dynamic tensions, and the 5 central themes I've tried to identify in her politics. Boy with Reed, 1928. 6 years into her Jamaican sojourn, Manley was already deeply engaged with the African-Jamaican form. Boy with Reed both valorizes and romanticizes while working within and beyond the post-war Western European modernist traditions. If the earlier and more successful Eve, with her African body but more European facial features, is representative of a transitional phase, then Boy with Reed is clear evidence of her commitment to a new aesthetic. Adam and Eve, 1930. In appreciating Adam and Eve, we need to remind ourselves of the context. There is at this moment no tradition of portraying black people in comfortable intimacy. There is further no tradition of portraying biblical characters as black, more so the two original human beings of the Old Testament as black. The portrayal itself, in the tenderness of Adam's grasp and the tentativeness of Eve's reaching out to him, leans to equality more than subordination, and is thus revolutionary on more than one level. Claiming the Bible for black people, proclaiming the naturalness of black love, and asserting gender equality. What could be more revolutionary? Negro Rose, 1935. Much has been written about Negro Rose as prophecy of the rebellion to come in 3 years, as proclamation of black pride, and as an awakening. I want to suggest that the heavenly gaze is certainly not one of awe and fear of a transcendent power, but rather the fixation on the vision of a new Jerusalem. The hands, out of proportion to the rest of the torso, are the oversized hands of labor and fount of all creativity. It is through the hands of black labor that the new Jerusalem will be realized. But is there not also in the silhouette of the statue from base to head the rugged contours of the Blue Mountains and an implicit statement about the nation and its sheer physical splendor, alongside chants of national liberation and salvation echoing in the peaks and valleys? Diggers, 1936. The theme of labor is made more explicit and collectivized in Diggers. Remember, this is 2 years before the labor rebellion of 1938. Yet here is Manley valorizing the inherent dignity in work with an almost Stakhanovite intensity. Critically, though with little surprise, the laborers are unmistakably African-Jamaican. 1936. Lest I be accused of androcentrism, Market Woman again captures the theme of the dignity of work, but this time with unmistakably Jamaican higglers. Hands akimbo, headed to the market, independent, willing to bargain for a fair price, but willing equally to kiss teeth and walk away from the customer if a ridiculous offer is proposed. Youth, 1938. This is a female version of Boy with a Reed, as it also captures the feistiness, parentheses, feistiness, explicit in Market Woman. However, I suggest it goes well beyond both in offering a profound statement of the power of Jamaican womanhood. This, and remember, it appears in the year of the Labour Rebellion, is a prophetic assertion of the latent possibilities in Jamaican women, which almost 80 years later is evident in the global statistics, where Jamaica, in its percentage of women managers, is at the head of the list of all countries. 7. Strike, 1938. It's for me Edna Manley's single most intriguing sculpture. Like Wayne Brown, I'm fascinated by the utilization of the image of a young man, purportedly PNP co-founder O.T. Fairclough, observing one of the strikes of 1938, to counterintuitively symbolize the typically kinetic notion of a strike. Instead of picket lines, placards, and all of the expected paraphernalia, we have instead a contemplative young black man, his hands stroking his chin in typical meditation style. Yet, if one were to imagine 1938 as a moment of intellectual awakening, as blinders being opened up on centuries of darkness, then the urgency of thought to reflect on what has been hidden and obscured, and more critically on what needs to be imagined and invented, is far more poignant than the mere representation of individuals or masses in action. Brother Man, 1961. Again, context is essential. Rastas were in the 50s the often feared rebellious element in the black underclass, barely understood, and certainly before the Smith, Oshie, and Nettleford Rastafari report, barely studied. This bust appears in the year after the Henry Rebellion, when Rastafarian leader Claudius Henry's son led a brief and abortive guerrilla insurgency against the still colonial Jamaican state, somewhat ironically with Norman Manley at the time as its premier. 3 years later, and post-independence, with Bustamante in charge, the notorious Coral Gardens events would lead to the death of a number of policemen and Rastafarians, followed by an arbitrary reign of terror and roundup of Rastafarians in the community surrounding Montego Bay. Brother Man is a remarkable assertion of the dignity of Rastafari and a statement of respect, coming, we should recall, from the wife of the premier and soon to be leader of the opposition. It should also be compared with The Voice, 1980. By 1980, Jamaica is in the turmoil of the long, bloody election campaign. But on the other hand, Rastafari has come into its own. Bob Marley and the Wailers have broken into the world arena, and as Max Romeo sang somewhat earlier, everybody joined Rasta bandwagon. But Edna was there before the bandwagon and managed in both her 1960 piece and this one 20 years later to capture the stillness, dignity, and dreadness in her iconic images of the Rastaman. Finally, Ghetto Mother, 1981. Rachel Manley describes Ghetto Mother as, quote, a culture and its people protecting itself and its ground, unquote. And she's right. Ghetto Mother, conceived in the cauldron of 1980 when violence was rife and everyone feared for their lives, is also a profoundly nationalist statement of a small country confronted by unimaginable military and economic power. The fright on the faces of the children is not only invoked through the close proximity of the offstage gunman, but by the entire uncertainty of these unknowable times. There may, however, be some solace in the sheer courage and power of defiant Jamaican motherhood. I conclude with the reminder that I've called my lecture a preliminary assessment, and indeed it is a work in progress, only scratching the surface of a rich vein that requires far more investigation. In the balance, there are many unanswered questions. How did Edna's own inherited melting pot of Wesleyan, Blakean, anarcho-spiritual Fabianism change over time? To what extent was Edna in turn influenced by Norman's own evolving philosophy as he rooted himself in his native land? Undoubtedly she was, but what in turn was her influence on him, and how did the two interact over the course of a lifetime? And what was the impact of this unique blend on the early PNP and the philosophical course of the national movement? And what profound impact did Edna have on her two sons, Douglas the elder and Michael the younger, in particular Michael of the politics of change, of democratic socialism, and most pointedly of struggle in the periphery, certainly his most politically combative work? None of these closing questions are of course answered, yet they suggest the profound gap, as raised in my opening remarks, on the role Edna Manley has played beyond her enormous artistic contribution to the political formation of modern Jamaica. I end with a brief quote from her diaries, which reflects, if nothing else, her dauntless spirit and, despite the tensions and contradictions that I have suggested, always persisted, her commitment to the island home of her choice and her mother's birthplace. It is the morning after the bitterly fought 1980 elections. Her husband Norman has been dead for some 11 years, and her son Michael's party has been ignominiously defeated, losing the elections 9 seats to 51. So-called deliverance has come. But for Edna, it is a deeply saddening, but not unrecognizable moment of reflection, but also of recommitment, and I end with her words, quote, "Another day. Last night I was a little bitter, but today that has gone. We have to blame ourselves as well. It's no moment for a post-mortem. It's enough to meet a new day. We fought a heroic election. And now what of the future? Where from here? Many will go away, but many will stay and life goes on. I think I will stay." Thank you.